The auction room went silent when phone bidder W47 offered $2 million for a simple wooden tennis racket. Billionaire collectors stared at each other in shock as the mysterious caller kept raising the stakes. What they didn't know was that the voice on the phone belonged to Serena Williams, and she wasn't bidding to buy the racket, she was bidding to give it away. Welcome to the story Gook. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden generosity and the power of giving back, tell me in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching today? And if you believe that true champions are measured not by what they win, but by what they give, hit that subscribe button, because this story will change everything you think you know about greatness. Sotheby's New York wasn't just any auction house. It was where the world's elite came to acquire pieces of history. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the hushed conversations carried the weight of billions of dollars changing hands with the casual raise of a numbered paddle. Tonight was special. Legends of Sport. The championship collection was being auctioned off by the estate of Harold Morrison, a reclusive billionaire who had spent 40 years collecting the most significant pieces of sports memorabilia in existence. The auction room held 200 of the world's wealthiest collectors, athletes, and celebrities. Russian oligarchs sat next to Silicon Valley tech billionaires. European royalty shared catalog notes with Hollywood moguls. Everyone had come for the same reason: to own a piece of sporting immortality. But the most intriguing bidder wasn't even in the room. Phone bidder C47 had registered 2 hours before the auction began, anonymous, as all phone bidders were entitled to be. Her voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of an accent that the auction house staff couldn't quite place. She had provided the required financial verification, a Goldman Sachs private banking letter confirming assets sufficient to cover potential purchases up to $10 million. Auctioneer James Whitfield, a distinguished man in his 60s who had conducted some of the most expensive art sales in history, had handled thousands of phone bidders over his career. But something about Serena 47 was different. Her responses were immediate, confident, and increasingly generous as the evening progressed. The auction began with Muhammad Ali's boxing gloves from the Rumble in the Jungle. Expected to sell for $500,000, they went to phone bidder Yusta 47 for $750,000 without hesitation. Next came Babe Ruth's game-worn Yankees jersey. Estimated value, $1.2 million. Star 47 secured it for $1.8 million, outbidding a consortium of Yankees investors who had planned to display it at the new stadium. Michael Jordan's sneakers from the 1991 NBA Finals. Pelé's World Cup medal from 1970. Wayne Gretzky's stick from his record-breaking goal. One by one, the most prestigious items in the collection were claimed by the mysterious phone bidder who seemed to have unlimited resources and zero hesitation. The auction house staff exchanged glances. In 20 years of conducting sales, they had never seen a single bidder acquire such a diverse and expensive collection of sports memorabilia. Phone bidder W47 had already spent over $8 million, and they were only halfway through the catalogue. But the evening's most anticipated lot was still to come. Dr. Patricia Chen, the auction house's head of sports memorabilia, approached the podium to introduce lot No. 23. The room fell silent with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying across the marble hall, "we now present the crown jewel of tonight's collection. This is not merely a tennis racket. This is a piece of history that changed the game forever." On the velvet-lined display stand sat a wooden Wilson Pro Staff Classic, its strings slightly worn, the grip tape faded from years of intense matches. To most people, it would look like any old tennis racket, but to those who knew tennis history, it was priceless. This is the racket used by Serena Williams to win her first Wimbledon championship in 2002, Dr. Chen continued. The very racket that marked the beginning of one of the most dominant careers in sports history. It comes with authentication from the All England Club and Williams' own verification from 2003. The room buzzed with excitement. Collectors leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't just sports memorabilia. This was an artifact from the career of someone many considered the greatest athlete of all time. "We'll open bidding at $500,000, Whitfield announced. Paddle number 12 went up immediately. 600,000, paddle number 34. 700,000. The Russian oligarch in the front row, 1 million. The tech billionaire from California, 1.2 million. But then, the voice that had dominated the evening spoke again through the auction house speakers. 1.5 million. Phone bidder number 47 was back. What followed was unlike anything Sotheby's had ever witnessed. The in-person bidders, accustomed to being the most powerful people in any room, found themselves in a battle with a ghost. They could see each other's faces, read each other's tells, gauge each other's determination. But phone bidder number 47 remained a mystery, a disembodied voice willing to pay any price. 1.7 million, called the Russian oligarch, his thick accent betraying a hint of irritation. 1.9 million, responded number 47 without pause. The tech billionaire David Park, founder of a social media empire worth $50 billion, raised his paddle aggressively. 2.2 million. 2.5 million, came the immediate response from the phone. Dr. Chen, watching from the sidelines, had never seen anything like it. She had authenticated the racket herself, working directly with Serena Williams. In 2003, when the tennis champion had decided to donate several pieces of her early career to various charities. But even she was stunned by the bidding war unfolding before her. Park leaned over to his advisor, whispering urgently. The Russian was making phone calls to what were presumably his financial advisors. A Saudi prince in the third row was shaking his head and lowering his paddle. Even his oil wealth had limits. But phone bidder number 47 never hesitated, never asked for a moment to consult with anyone, never showed any sign that the escalating prices caused her concern. 2.8 million, Park called out, sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the auction house's perfect climate control. 3 million, responded 47. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. $3 million for a tennis racket. Any tennis racket was unprecedented. James Whitfield, in 4 decades of conducting auctions, had developed an instinct for when bidders were reaching their limits. He could see the tells, the hesitation before raising a paddle, the consultation with advisors, the subtle shift in body language that indicated financial strain. But phone bidder number 47 displayed none of these signs. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than millions of dollars. 3.5 million, Park said, his voice tight with tension. 4 million, came the immediate reply. At this point, several things were happening simultaneously in the auction room. Security guards had been discreetly positioned near the phone bank where the auction house staff was managing the remote bidders. Background verification protocols that normally happened after the auction were being expedited in real time. Dr. Chen was frantically texting with her colleagues who had handled the original authentication of the racket. But the most significant development was happening in the minds of the people who had come to bid on the racket. Park had built his fortune by knowing when to hold and when to fold. His business empire was built on calculated risks and knowing his limits. At $4 million for a tennis racket, he had reached his. The Russian oligarch, Dmitry Volkov, owned one of the world's largest private collections of sports memorabilia. His yacht featured a dedicated museum with items worth over $200 million, but even he recognized that this had moved beyond reasonable collecting into something else entirely. 4.2 million, Volkov called out, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier in the evening. 5 million, came the response from phone bidder 47. The room fell completely silent. $5 million for a tennis racket was more than some entire collections were worth. It was more than many people would earn in a lifetime. It was, by any rational measure, completely insane. Whitfield, with his decades of experience reading auction rooms, knew that the in-person bidders were done. The psychological barrier of 5 million had broken their resolve, but protocol required him to give them a chance. "I have 5 million from our phone bidder," he announced formally. "Do I hear 5.2 million? Silence. 5.1 million? Nothing. The bid stands at $5 million. Going once?" Dr. Chen was staring at her phone, reading and rereading a text message she had just received from a colleague at the International Tennis Hall of Fame. Her face had gone pale. "Going twice." She started walking quickly toward the auctioneer's podium, her heels clicking urgently on the marble floor. "Sold for $5 million to phone bidder number." "Wait!" Dr. Chen called out, reaching the podium just as Whitfield's gavel was about to fall. She whispered something urgently in his ear. Whitfield's eyes widened. He looked down at Dr. Chen, then at the phone where bidder Ma 47 was waiting, then back at Dr. Chen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly, his voice carrying a strange mixture of confusion and awe, "I need to verify something with our phone bidder before we can complete this transaction." The room was electric with tension. Something unprecedented was happening, and no one knew what. Whitfield pressed the button to speak directly to phone bidder George 47. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a question before we finalize this sale. Dr. Chen, our authentication expert, has received some information that requires verification." "Of course," came the calm reply. "Ma'am, are you Serena Williams?" The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud. 200 of the world's wealthiest and most powerful people sat frozen, their minds trying to process what they had just heard. James Whitfield, who had conducted thousands of auctions over 4 decades, had never asked such a question. Dr. Chen stood beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she held her phone. The pause seemed to last forever. Then, through the speakers that had carried the mysterious voice of phone bidder the 47 all evening, came a sound that changed everything. Laughter. Not nervous laughter, not embarrassed laughter, but the warm, genuine laughter of someone who had been caught in the best possible way. "Yes," came the familiar voice that millions of people around the world had heard in victory speeches and press conferences. "This is Serena Williams." The auction room erupted. David Park, the tech billionaire who had been bidding against her, started laughing and shaking his head in disbelief. The Russian oligarch leaned back in his chair with a rueful smile, finally understanding why his opponent had been so unshakable. The Saudi prince began applauding, followed by dozens of others, but Dr. Chen wasn't celebrating. She was staring at her phone with a mixture of shock and confusion. "Ms. Williams," she called out toward the speakers, her voice carrying across the now buzzing auction room, "I need to ask you something. I was the person who authenticated this racket in 2003. I worked with you directly, but according to my records, you donated this racket to the Williams Sisters Foundation 13 years ago. Why are you buying back something you already gave away?" The room fell silent again. This was a twist no one had expected. Serena's voice came through the speakers, but now it carried a warmth and emotion that hadn't been there during the clinical bidding process. "Dr. Chen, you have an excellent memory. You're absolutely right. I did donate that racket to our foundation in 2003, along with several other pieces from my early career. But what you might not know is what happened to it after that." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a sadness that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. The Williams Sisters Foundation used those items in various fundraising efforts over the years. We auctioned some pieces. We displayed others at charity events. We used them to raise money for tennis programs in underserved communities. That racket, it was supposed to go to a young girl named Maria Santos, who had won our junior scholarship program in 2010. The room was completely quiet now. Even the auction house staff had stopped their bustling to listen. Maria was 15 years old. She lived in Compton just like Venus and I did. She was incredibly talented, but her family couldn't afford the coaching, the travel, the equipment she needed to pursue tennis seriously. Our foundation was going to change that. The racket was going to be presented to her as a symbol of what was possible. Dr. Chen's eyes were wide as she listened. Other people in the room were pulling out their phones, likely looking up the story Serena was telling. But 3 days before the presentation ceremony, Maria was killed in a drive-by shooting. She was walking home from tennis practice at the public courts we had helped fund. She was carrying the acceptance letter for our program in her backpack. Several people in the auction room were visibly emotional now. This wasn't just about money or memorabilia anymore. After Maria died, her family was devastated. Her mother, Eleanor, blamed tennis for her daughter's death. She said if Maria hadn't been so focused on tennis, she would have been home safe instead of walking through the neighborhood at night after practice. Elena refused to accept the scholarship, refused any help from our foundation, and she asked us to take back the racket. Serena's voice was thick with emotion now, and Dr. Chen was wiping tears from her eyes. We tried to convince Elena to keep it, to honor Maria's memory, but she said seeing it would only remind her of what her daughter would never achieve. So, we respected her wishes. The racket went back into storage, and eventually, it ended up in Harold Morrison's collection when our foundation had to liquidate some assets during the 2008 financial crisis. The auction room was completely silent except for the quiet sound of several people crying. Dr. Chen, I've been trying to track down that racket for 15 years. When I saw it listed in tonight's auction, I knew I had to get it back. Not for me, I have plenty of trophies and memorabilia. I need it for Elena. For Elena? Dr. Chen asked softly. Elena Santos is 58 years old now. She works 3 jobs to support her grandchildren. 2 weeks ago, her 12-year-old granddaughter Isabella told her she wanted to learn tennis. Elena called me. For the first time in 15 years, she called me. Serena's voice was barely above a whisper now, but in the silence of the auction room, everyone could hear every word. She said Maria had been right about tennis. She said maybe if there were more programs like ours, fewer kids would be on the streets, and maybe her daughter would still be alive. She asked if our foundation could help Isabella the way we had tried to help Maria. Dr. Chen was openly crying now, and she wasn't alone. I'm buying this racket back because tomorrow Isabella Santos is going to receive it at the presentation ceremony that her Aunt Maria never got to attend. Elena is going to present it to her, and we're going to name our new Compton tennis facility the Maria Santos Center for Young Athletes. The auction room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite applause of wealthy collectors appreciating a good story. It was the thunderous, emotional applause of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. James Whitfield, who had thought he had seen everything in 40 years of auctions, was struggling to maintain his professional composure. He had never presided over the sale of an item where the buyer's story was more valuable than the item itself. But Serena wasn't finished. Mr. Whitfield, I need to make one more request. Of course, Ms. Williams. I know I've already won the racket, but I'd like to make an additional purchase. I'd like to buy every other item I won tonight. The Ali gloves, the Jordan shoes, the Gretzky stick, all of it. And I'd like to donate everything to the International Sports Museum with one condition, that they create a permanent exhibit about athletes who died young, dreams that were cut short, and the importance of creating safe spaces for kids to pursue their passions. The applause was so loud now that security guards were looking concerned about the structural integrity of the chandeliers. David Park, the tech billionaire who had been bidding against her, stood up and started a standing ovation. Within seconds, the entire auction room was on its feet, but in all the noise and emotion, Dr. Chen noticed something that would make this night even more extraordinary than it already was. She walked over to James Whitfield and whispered something in his ear. His eyes widened and he nodded. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitfield called out, his voice barely audible over the applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, please." The room gradually quieted. "Ms. Williams, Dr. Chen has just informed me of something remarkable. Mr. Morrison, the original owner of tonight's collection, left specific instructions in his will about the tennis racket. Instructions that were sealed until tonight." Serena's voice came through the speakers. "What kind of instructions?" "Mr. Morrison wrote that if Serena Williams ever attempted to purchase the racket, the sale price should be donated to the Williams Sisters Foundation, all $5 million. The room was silent for a moment as people processed what this meant. "Ms. Williams," Whitfield continued, "you just bought your own racket and donated $5 million to your own foundation." Through the speakers came the sound that would be replayed millions of times in the days to come. Serena Williams laughing with pure, unrestrained joy. "Well," she said between laughs, "I guess Harold Morrison was a better person than any of us knew." What happened next would be talked about in New York society circles for years to come. Just as James Whitfield was preparing to conclude the most extraordinary auction in Sotheby's history, the marble doors at the back of the auction room opened. Every head turned to see who was entering so late in the evening. It was Serena Williams, the real Serena Williams, in person, walking slowly down the center aisle of the auction room with a dignity and grace that commanded absolute silence. She was wearing a simple black dress and carrying a small purse, looking like she'd just left a dinner party rather than conducted a $5 million phone auction, but she wasn't alone. Beside her walked an older Hispanic woman with graying hair and tired eyes, and next to her, a 12-year-old girl with braided hair and a worn tennis bag slung over her shoulder. Elena Santos and Isabella Santos. Dr. Chen, who had spent the last hour in an emotional whirlwind, felt her knees go weak as she realized what was happening. Serena had never been on the phone. She had been outside the entire time, with Elena and Isabella waiting for this moment. The auction room, filled with some of the most sophisticated and worldly people on the planet, was completely silent as they tried to process this impossibility. How could Serena Williams have been bidding by phone if she was walking into the room right now? James Whitfield, his professional composure finally cracking, looked from Serena to the phone bank to Dr. Chen to the mysterious family walking down. "At the aisle, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice barely steady. "If you're here, then who was phone bidder number 47? Serena smiled as she reached the front of the auction room. She looked up at the podium where Whitfield stood, then at Dr. Chen, then at the 200 stunned faces staring at her. "Mr. Whitfield, I'd like you to meet phone bidder on 47. She turned to the 12-year-old girl beside her. "This is Isabella Santos. She's been saving her money from babysitting and chores for 2 years to buy her first professional tennis racket. When she heard that my old Wimbledon racket was being auctioned tonight, she asked if she could try to bid on it." The room was so quiet that the sound of someone's phone buzzing seemed jarring. "I told Isabella that adult auctions were very expensive and that professional collectors with lots of money would probably be bidding. But she said she had been learning about auctions on YouTube, and she thought if she sounded grown-up and professional, maybe no one would know she was 12. Isabella Santos who had been standing quietly beside her grandmother, stepped forward slightly. When she spoke, her voice was exactly the same calm, professional voice that had been phone bidder 47 all evening. "I had $47 saved." "Up," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auction room. "I knew it wasn't enough for a real auction, but Miss Serena said she would help me if I really wanted to try." Dr. Chen was crying again, but now she was also laughing. "So every time Isabella made a bid," Serena continued, "I was standing behind her, ready to cover whatever amount she offered. She didn't know how much money was involved. She just knew she wanted that racket because it represented everything she hoped to achieve." David Park, the tech billionaire who had been bidding against a 12-year-old girl all evening, put his head in his hands and started laughing. "Isabella," Serena said gently, "would you like to tell everyone why you wanted this particular racket?" The 12-year-old looked around at the room full of billionaires and celebrities, then at her grandmother, then back at the crowd. "My Aunt Maria was supposed to get this racket when she was 15, Isabella said, her young voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "She died before she could. My grandma told me that Maria would have been the greatest tennis player ever, even better than Miss Serena." Elena Santos, who had been silent up to this point, stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion and a Spanish accent that made her words even more powerful. "Maria used to say that someday she would have a racket like Serena Williams," Elena said. "She would practice with this old wooden racket we bought at a garage sale, and she would pretend it was the same one Serena used to win Wimbledon. She would hit balls against the wall behind our apartment building for hours, saying, 'Someday, someday.'" Eleanor looked up at the racket still displayed on the auction stand. "When Isabella told me she wanted to learn tennis, I was scared. I was angry. I thought I had protected her from the dream that killed her aunt. But Isabella, she said something to me that changed my mind." She paused, looking at her granddaughter with pride and sadness mixed together. She said, "Grandma, Aunt Maria didn't die because she loved tennis. She died because she didn't have safe places to play tennis. Miss Serena builds safe places." The emotion in the room was overwhelming now. Hardened business executives were wiping their eyes. Russian oligarchs were applauding. Saudi princes were standing in respect. But Serena wasn't finished with the surprises. "Isabella," she said, walking over to the auction stand where the racket sat in its velvet case. "This racket doesn't belong to me anymore. It doesn't belong to Mr. Morrison's estate. It doesn't belong to Sotheby's auction house." She carefully lifted the racket from its case and walked back to where Isabella and Eleanor stood. "This racket belongs to the girl who was brave enough to bid $5 million with $47 in her pocket, because she understood that some things are worth more than money." She held out the racket to Isabella, but before the girl could take it, Serena added one more thing. "Isabella, I'm also giving you something else. I'm giving you Maria's dream. Tomorrow, you start training at the new Maria Santos Center for Young Athletes. And someday, when you win your first championship, I want you to use this racket to do it." Isabella Santos, 12 years old, took the racket that had started one of the greatest tennis careers in history and would now start another. The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. But the evening wasn't over. James Whitfield, who had presided over some of the most expensive auctions in history, found himself in completely uncharted territory. A 12-year-old had just won a $5 million auction item. A dead billionaire had donated $5 million to a foundation from beyond the grave, and the greatest tennis player who ever lived had just passed the torch to the next generation in front of 200 witnesses. As the applause died down and people began to collect themselves, Whitfield realized he had a room full of some of the wealthiest people in the world who had just witnessed something extraordinary, and several of them were looking like they wanted to be part of it. David Park was the first to approach the podium. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I'd like to make a purchase." "Sir, I'd like to buy 1 hour of tennis lessons with Isabella Santos. I'll pay $50,000, and the money goes to the Maria Santos Center." Isabella's eyes went wide. Elena Santos looked confused, but Serena just smiled. "Sir," Whitfield said carefully, "this is a sports memorabilia auction. We don't typically auction tennis lessons." "Then let's make this atypical," called out the Russian oligarch Dmitry Volkov. "I'll pay $100,000 for Isabella to name one of the courts at the new tennis center after my daughter, who died in a car accident last year. She was a tennis player too." The Saudi prince stood up. "I'll donate $200,000 for the construction of a memorial wall at the center, honoring young athletes who died before achieving their dreams." Within minutes, what had started as a sports memorabilia auction had become an impromptu charity fundraiser. Dr. Chen was frantically taking notes as auction attendees pledged money for everything from court naming rights to equipment donations to scholarship funds. A Hollywood producer offered to fund a documentary about Maria Santos and other young athletes whose dreams were cut short. A tech entrepreneur pledged to provide technology infrastructure for the tennis center. A fashion designer promised to create custom tennis outfits for all the young players in the program, but the most meaningful donation came from an unexpected source. Elena Santos, who had been quietly watching the wealthy strangers pledge enormous sums of money in her daughter's memory, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely audible in the large room. James Whitfield, who was trying to keep track of pledges that had already exceeded $2 million, gestured for quiet. "Yes, ma'am?" Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "I want to donate something too," she said. She opened the envelope and pulled out a faded photograph. Even from a distance, people could see that it showed a young girl in tennis clothes, holding a racket and smiling at the camera. "This is the only picture I have of Maria playing tennis," Elena said. "I kept it hidden for 15 years because it hurt too much to look at. But I want it to be in the memorial wall so other people can see that she was real, that she mattered, that she had dreams." She walked up to Dr. Chen and handed her the photograph. "And I want to donate something else," Elena continued, turning back to face the room. "I want to donate my anger." The room was completely silent. For 15 years, I was angry at tennis. I was angry at the neighborhood. I was angry at God. I was angry at everyone who got to live the dream that Maria couldn't. But tonight, I learned that anger doesn't honor my daughter. Building something beautiful honors her." She looked at Isabella, who was still holding the historic tennis racket with both hands. "My granddaughter's going to play tennis. She's going to be safe while she plays tennis. And maybe, if we're very lucky, she's going to be great at tennis. And when she is, Maria's spirit will be part of that greatness." Elena turned to Serena. "Miss Williams, I want to work at the Maria Santos Center. I don't know anything about tennis, but I know about keeping children safe. I know about protecting dreams. I want to help make sure that no other grandmother loses what I lost." Serena walked over to Elena and embraced her. And the two women, one who had achieved every possible dream in tennis and one whose dreams had been destroyed by tragedy, held each other while 200 strangers applauded. But Isabella had been thinking during all of this, and she had something to say too. "Miss Serena," she said, her young voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere. "I have a question." "What is it, sweetheart?" "If I use this racket to win championships, and then I get old and retire like you did, what should I do with it?" Serena smiled, and her answer would become the motto of the Maria Santos Center for Young Athletes. "Isabella, when that day comes, you find another little girl with $47 and a dream, and you give her the same chance that someone gave you. Isabella nodded solemnly as if she were making a vow. "I promise," she said. The auction officially concluded at 11:47 p.m., but most people stayed until well after midnight, sharing stories, making connections, and planning ways to support the tennis center that had been born out of a 12-year-old's courage and a champion's generosity. 6 months later, the Maria Santos Center for Young Athletes held its grand opening in Compton, California. The facility was everything that Maria Santos had dreamed of as a 15-year-old. 6 professional quality courts, a state-of-the-art training facility, locker rooms that rivaled those at Wimbledon, and a memorial wall featuring photographs of young athletes whose dreams had been cut short by tragedy. But the heart of the center wasn't the courts or the equipment. It was the program itself. Every child who enrolled received the same thing Isabella Santos had received, a chance to pursue their dreams in a safe environment, surrounded by people who believed in their potential. Elena Santos worked there as the Director of Student Safety, a position created specifically for her. Her job was simple: make sure every child felt protected, valued, and loved while they pursued their tennis dreams. Isabella Santos, now 13, was the center's first scholarship recipient and its unofficial ambassador. She practiced every day after school, using the Wimbledon racket that had started it all. But she also spent time with younger children, teaching them that champions are made not just through talent, but through perseverance, kindness, and the support of their community. Serena Williams visited the center every week, but not as a celebrity making a publicity appearance. She came as a coach, a mentor, and a friend to children who were walking the same path she had walked decades earlier. The auction at Sotheby's had raised over $7 million that night, not just from the items sold, but from the spontaneous donations pledged by people who had witnessed something extraordinary. But more importantly, it had created something that couldn't be measured in dollars, a living memorial to a young woman whose dream hadn't died with her, but had been passed down to a new generation. David Park, the tech billionaire who had unknowingly bid against a 12-year-old, became the center's largest corporate sponsor. But he also became something else: Isabella's math tutor, helping her with homework every Tuesday evening via video call, because he had learned that champions needed to excel in the classroom as well as on the court. The Russian oligarch Dmitry Volkov flew to Los Angeles every 3 months to visit the court named after his daughter. He would sit quietly in the stands, watching young players practice, and sometimes people would see him crying. But they were good tears. Tears of healing, tears of hope, tears of a father who had found a way to honor his child's memory by supporting other children's dreams. Dr. Patricia Chen left Sotheby's to become the center's director of historical preservation. Her job was to collect and preserve the stories of all the young athletes who trained there, ensuring that their dreams and achievements would be remembered long after they moved on to professional careers or other pursuits. But perhaps the most important change was in the culture of youth sports itself. The Maria Santos Center became a model that was replicated in cities across the country. The idea that sports programs should prioritize safety, community, and personal development over pure competition began to spread. Other tennis centers, basketball programs, and youth sports leagues adopted the Maria Santos principles. Every child deserves a safe place to play. Every dream deserves protection. Every champion has a responsibility to lift up the next generation. Isabella Santos, who had started this journey with $47 and the courage to make an impossible bid, was now ranked among the top junior players in California. But when sports reporters asked her about her goals, she didn't talk about winning tournaments or achieving rankings. "I want to be like Miss Serena," she would say. "Not just win championships, but build places where other kids can win championships, too." The racket that Serena Williams had used to win her first Wimbledon championship was now being used by Isabella Santos to chase her own dreams. But it was also something more, a symbol of how greatness isn't just about individual achievement, but about creating opportunities for others to achieve greatness too. And every Tuesday evening, when practice ended and the courts grew quiet, Isabella would carefully place the historic racket in its case and whisper the same words that had become a tradition at the center. "This is for you, Aunt Maria. This is for everyone who didn't get their chance. This is for everyone who will." On the memorial wall beneath Maria Santos's photograph, a plaque bore the inscription that had been suggested by Elena Santos herself. "Dreams don't die with the dreamer. They live on in everyone who dares to dream the same dream." The auction at Sotheby's had ended with the sale of a tennis racket, but it had really been the beginning of something much more valuable, a legacy of hope, a community of champions, and the understanding that true greatness is measured not by what you achieve, but by what you make possible for others. Serena Williams had bid $5 million for a racket she had already owned once before. But what she had really purchased was the chance to complete a promise that had been interrupted by tragedy 15 years earlier, the promise that every child, regardless of their circumstances, deserves the chance to chase their dreams in safety, with support, and with the knowledge that someone believes in their potential. The greatest champion who ever lived had taught the world that the most important victory isn't the one you win for yourself. It's the one you make possible for someone else. So now I ask you, have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's generosity created opportunities that changed not just one life, but an entire community? Have you seen how a single act of kindness can honor the past while building the future? Share that story in the comments below, because at the Storybook, we believe that the most powerful victories are the ones that create more champions, not fewer. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true champions aren't just made by winning, they're made by lifting others up. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, sometimes the most valuable thing you can bid on isn't something you want to own, it's something you want to give away.